Harrod and Jones burned 4 samples of World Trade Center dust and carefully measured the energy output of each, plotting them on this graph with 4 different colored lines. The blue line shows the lowest energy output of the 4, requiring the highest temperature for the ignition point of the 4 samples. Then they superimposed the blue line, the least energetic of the dust samples, to the known nanothermite sample, and they claimed that the energy reaction was a close match. But look, it's not. The World Trade Center dust sample ignited 100 degrees Celsius lower than the known nanothermites, and the reaction itself was stronger by a factor of 2. Another sample released 5 times as much energy as the known nanothermites. Let's put them next to each other, I'll show you. Thermite actually produces much less heat than plain old carbon-based burning, much to my surprise. It produces higher temperatures, but heat and temperature are not the same. Heat is the total energy of atomic or molecular motion in matter, and temperature is the average kinetic energy of the particles in a sample of matter. Thermite contains about 4 megajoules of heat energy per kilogram. Wood contains about 18, gasoline over 40, more than 10 times as much. So if you could run your car on thermite, you'd need more than 10 times as much to go the same distance. Now, for a real-life example, the temperature of a burning match is around 1100 degrees, but the heat that it generates is so small that I can put it out with my hands and barely hurt myself. Similar temperatures in a big fire, obviously, would incinerate me. So the most likely conclusion is that Harrod's samples had some carbon-based material in them that simply burned in the surrounding air, and that was not a thermite reaction. If we're looking at unexploded thermites in the dust, where are the unexploded triggering devices? The experiment also failed to isolate important variables. Those red-gray chips in the experiment were heated in air. Thermites burn without oxygen, so experimenters should have created an atmosphere of nitrogen or argon. Any energy released would then have to come from some non-carbon-based reaction. 9/11 researcher Niels Harrod responded directly to my assertion by saying, quote, "World Trade Center was not demolished under argon." But his experiment should have been designed to eliminate variables, not replicate the conditions of 9/11. Here's another variable they didn't isolate. There was a carbon compound in the dust sample, but in order to properly determine the energy of the thermite, you must separate out the carbon for evidence of a thermite reaction. Their failure to remove oxygen in the air and carbon from the dust are serious flaws in this experiment. In his initial nanothermitic experiment, Tillotson used a method called PXRD to identify the chemical makeup of the reaction products. The chemist I talked to said Harrod should have used the same on these unreacted chips. In our debate, Gage flashed a spectrograph of known thermites versus the dust onto the screen. They didn't look the same. He never explained why they proved thermites or even how to read a spectrograph. Aluminum and iron oxide were found in the dust in Jones's original study, but not aluminum oxide. Aluminum oxide would be evidence of burned thermitic material. White smoke coming from the burning buildings is seen by some as evidence of aluminum oxide, but hot fires can emit that color smoke for other reasons, and the boiling temperature of aluminum oxide is over 5,300 degrees. Thermate also has barium nitrate, but that does not appear in the dust. Kevin Ryan personally told me they had not adequately tested for fluorine in the dust, and more experiments are needed to show that this element, which could have been used to stabilize the silicon, was there. This is just something that needs more follow-up. All the ingredients in the dust were also present in the towers. Iron can be found in paint and electrical equipment. Manganese is in steel. Fluorine is found in the 200,000 pounds of freon used to air condition the buildings. Titanium was in the planes and WTC building itself. Potassium is an ingredient in the 100 million pounds of concrete flooring. Chemists say the various element bondings may have occurred naturally in the fire, and that these chips come from paint, fire retardant, vermiculite, soundproofing, and rustproofing. They also question if the red-gray chips that they based their paper on could be a rust-inhibiting primer paint with a kaolinite base. They didn't extract a larger sample of the red and gray chips with a more aggressive solvent, such as hot DMF, which would allow analysis of individual components. I wrote an email to Richard Gage saying that, quote, "I am not convinced that this experiment has fully separated out the naturally occurring elements in the buildings themselves from the thermitic chemicals." Richard got this response from lead experimenter Niels Harrod, quote, "Sorry, I give up. You cannot provide a meaningful answer to a meaningless question. This is a common question based on ignorance. But most people understand that you do not have a stew because you have meat on one side and potatoes on the other. And you do not have stew if you have a hamburger with meat and toasted onions from potatoes, true, on the other. I'd like to talk now about the Bentham Open Journals. They're available to anyone who pays the $800 fee to publish their material. That's why they're called an open journal. One graduate student submitted pure gobbledygook and had it accepted for publication. The Bentham editor didn't even know the Thermitic article was appearing and was being published, and when it came out, she resigned in protest, saying it should never have been published, period. We should let the experiment speak for itself, however. I also, though, have to contest the assertion that the Bentham Open Journals are actually peer-reviewed. Niels Harrit strongly disagrees, saying, quote, "Chris hasn't understood what a scientific publication is. It is a set of data, a discussion, and the best hypothesis of the day. That is all. No more, no less. It quacks like a duck. It waddles like a duck. It looks like a duck. Maybe it is a duck. He may question the data, accuse us of falsifying the samples or the data. In that case, there can be no discussion, and we just split. If he accepts the data, he should recognize that nobody has come up with a better hypothesis for interpretation of the results. That is, if somebody came along and proved that the duck-looking creature was a gene-modified goat, then we must be forced to accept that. But it hasn't happened." Related to Richard's claims of thermitic dust is his assertion that the EPA's Eric Schwartz found 1,3-diphenyl propane at levels that dwarfed all others. We've never observed it in any sampling we've ever done, close quote. But Richard edits out the next sentence in the article from the Times-Union where this quote appeared. Quote, "He also said it was most likely produced by the plastic of tens of thousands of burning computers." Richard's claim that Sol-Gel uses 1,3-diphenyl propane comes from a controversial article published shortly after 9/11 in The Environmentalist, where the author claimed that 1,3-diphenyl propane was evidence of nanothermite. The claim is so obscure, when I brought this up to Niels Harrit, he knew nothing about this, and he certainly didn't find it in the dust that he was studying. So why am I holding out the possibility that this experiment has validity? I see this experiment obviously as flawed and incomplete so far, and I've shared these objections personally with Kevin Ryan. He has admitted that they heated the chips in air and not argon or nitrogen. But then he goes on to say something very interesting. Quote, "The energy given off was shown to be as high as typical high explosives, and the sharp spike in release was an important finding," close quote. So while the high energy released in the burning of the chips is used as evidence against nanothermites by some, Kevin Ryan sees it as evidence in favor of it. Kevin goes on to say that, quote, "The chips match with nanothermite. In 2001, Tillotson showed aluminum microspheres in his nanothermite. I couldn't find evidence of this in Harrit's chips, but I could be wrong." Kevin Ryan also told me that, quote, "The red-gray chips tested do not withstand 650 degrees centigrade, do not have zinc, and don't dissolve in an organic solvent, but known paint chips do. I have World Trade Center paint samples, and I can tell you that in addition to these facts, the paint was nothing like the red-gray chips." Kevin reminded me that their study claimed to find unignited thermitic material, saying aluminum oxide is a product, not a component of the thermitic reaction. The source of oxygen is not aluminum oxide, but iron oxide. Thermate is not 41% aluminum oxide or any percent aluminum oxide. This backwards claim is another reason for you to suspect that you are not dealing with real scientists. And I am definitely not a real scientist, as we all know, but I did read the original Tillotson report, and in his, the nanothermite, the unignited aluminum spheres are 70% oxide by weight, so the oxide is there in a nanothermite, apparently. Kevin Ryan has been very patient with me. He knows an awful lot more about chemistry than I do. I'm grateful for the time he's given me to answer my questions. And not being a chemist, I can't really debate him. The best I can do is fairly represent his argument and the argument on the other side. Kevin may yet be proven right. The next step is to complete the discovery process by scheduling a presentation of their findings to a group of qualified scientists and allowing for educated debate and evaluation of their findings in the public sphere. In our debate, Richard Gage said, quote, "We need repeatable experiments on the dust." He's right. Experiments must be independently replicated, and this one has a poor record of that. At least 2 9/11 activists followed up on the dust. Frédéric-Henri Cormier wrote, "Eventually, the presence of nanothermite could not be confirmed." Marc Basile burned the chips in air, replicating the error of the original experiment and not even measuring the energy released. The original experiment properly used a differential scattering calorimeter to measure how much energy their chips produced when they reacted. I personally can't take seriously fellow controlled demolition advocates who appeared in the acknowledgments of the original study that are now cooking red chips at home without proper measuring tools. It's time to release their thermitic dust samples to an independent lab for testing. They would be objective and independent and cost as little as $2,000. It's not enough to run a magnet over the dust and say, look, iron. It's not enough to give the dust samples to yet another 9/11 truth insider. And even the most hardened skeptic has told me, quote, if the dust tested positive for thermitics, that would get my attention. So to the experimenters, Neil Harrod, Jeffrey Ferrer, Stephen Jones, Kevin Ryan, Frank Legge, Daniel Farnsworth, Greg Roberts, James Gurley, and Bradley Larson, this is your chance to live up to the name of 9/11 truth. Niels Harrod responded in a recent email by simply saying, quote, 2 years of silence makes me quite confident. The absence of review is the best review I've got, close quote. As for my suggestion of sending it to for more study, quote, this is the true debunker argument. They just ask for more when they are buried in smoking guns. We must constantly remind ourselves and them that it is not our duty to prove them wrong. It is their duty to prove them right. Niels Harrod, unless you replicate your experiment with truly independent and eminently affordable tests, I will not accept the results of your initial experiment. NIST will continue to say that there is no chain of custody proving the original samples were not tampered with. But Harrod, Jones, and the rest did the best they possibly could to maintain a chain of custody with the dust. If a sample of their dust tested positive for thermites, I, for one, would challenge NIST to provide one of their dust samples to do another $2,000 test. I think an independent verification of this experiment would carry real scientific weight. You want the government to give you an independent investigation? Here is an independent investigation you can do on your own. In my mind, this is the single most important and essential next step you can take to bring it right into the scientific mainstream. Believe me, I am willing and waiting to be proven wrong.